Hi everyone, let's to talk today about ecology, specifically ecology of population. So this is chapter 30 in matters. And so we're basically going to look at what ecology is and how do we define it, and then comparing more developed countries to lower developed countries and kind of what the trends are that we see with regards to population. So what is the study of ecology? So ecology is the study where we look at the interaction of organisms, not only with each other, but also with their physical environment. So organisms interacting with each other would include not only interacting with other individuals, but the way that we interact with our pets and with insects and with birds in our environment, as well as our physical environment, which would include the temperature, the weather, the water, so all of these other abiotic items. And so ecologists, in order to study this, are able to develop different models that kind of help explain and predict the distribution of different populations and the abundance of population based on how they interact within their ecosystem. So here we have this image right here that just kind of looks at the study of where we live, and we can kind of see that in addition to kind of seeing the interaction, we might kind of see how biodiverse that area is, how do species interact with each other, how do different species able to populate, and what are human impact, because we actually have a lot of impact on our environment. So how do humans impact the environment, and then just kind of how energy is flowing, right? So we can kind of look at also the environment with regards to the producer's life versus the consumers. These are all different things to kind of take into consideration when we're looking at the study of ecology. So what are the levels of ecology? So we visited this before, where we can start off with the individual organism, right? And how does that organism adapt to their environment? And then how do all the different individuals of that species, which forms a population, interact with the environment? And then moving up from that, how do these species, so here we have these little fishes here, but we also have all of these other different organisms. So how do all of the different species and all of these different populations be able to interact? And that would be our community level. And then now take into consideration not only all the living organisms, but also the physical environment, right? So the lake, the rocks, the sun, the temperature, all of that would be the ecosystem. And then we have multiple ecosystems on the biosphere. So the biosphere would consist of all of these different ecosystems. So human population is not distributed evenly across the world. So the majority of the human population actually live in Asia, and most of them are actually living in China or India. So I kind of pointed out roughly where. This is not maybe the best map, but I wanted to just kind of show the continents so we can see that most of the human population is actually in these two countries here of Asia. So here, this image right here will actually show us the growth rate. And as you can see, the growth rate is not similar to the human population distribution. It's not distributed evenly, right? So we have certain population that are growing a lot faster compared to other population. So in the United States, we can see that we're not growing as rapidly compared to many of the other continents and countries. And so human growth originally kind of grew a little bit more constant. There wasn't this exponential growth, but then we found that after the Industrial Revolution, which is about here, there was an increased amount of jobs and food, and so human population at that point started to really rapidly grow. And so you see that it moves kind of from this constant rate to pretty much an exponential rate, right? So right now, human growth is pretty exponential. This is also contributed to modern science and medicine, right? Making it so that people can stay healthier for a lot longer, they're able to live longer. So we consider the growth rate as the number of people who die each year minus the number of people who are born. And so if we compare those two numbers and look at the growth rate is currently growing very rapidly. And so what are some of the concerns with the human population growth? Well, the human population right now, because it is growing exponentially, it's estimated that it will double in roughly 67 years, which is really pretty rapid. And so some of the concern is, can the Earth actually support this increased number of people? There's a carrying capacity, which is the amount of resources that are actually available for human relative to the number of human. So are we reaching our carrying capacity? And Earth carrying capacity for humans hasn't actually been determined. So some scientists believe that we are going to be beyond our carrying capacity, whereas there are other scientists that are debating that they think that Earth can actually, that Earth still has room for humans to grow. Some of the other concern in certain areas is that humans have basic needs, right? So we need shelter, we need food, we need fresh water. So if we have too many people, how can we provide resources that are basic human needs to everyone? So when we take into consideration the human population, the number of people that a certain region can support, we actually have to kind of look at some of the trends with regards to different regions and different areas, right? So moving on, we're going to kind of compare more developed countries to lower developed countries, and you'll find that between these two categories, there's some striking differences with regards to how much resource they use and how that impacts their population and their growth rates. So countries are typically divided into more developed countries and lower developed countries. So here, the blue lands are the more developed countries, and so you have the United States falling into that. But we also have, as you can recognize, Canada up here, right? And then the least developed countries, and this is according to Human Development Index, right, would be like many of these countries here that, for example, that are in Africa, as well as some that are in Asia. And so with these two different populations, because of the different needs and resources that are available, we tend to see that these different groups will differ in how their population is divided. So in a more developed country, they tend to have, these are age structures. So both these are age structures. They tend to have more stable age structure. What does that mean? That means that it's found that their pre-reproductive age, that the number of pre-reproductive age is pretty similar to the number of reproductive age, and pretty similar to the number of post-reproductive age. And so in more developed countries, they tend to have stable age structure. There's about equal number of each aging population, whereas in less developed countries, we tend to see populations that are continuing to expand, which means that there's not that many, with regards to the age structure, of people in the post-reproductive age, so the older age, but you actually have a lot more people that reside in the pre-reproductive age, which would be the younger. So those would be people who are under 20 years old. That there's quite a bit here, so you can see that the population is continuing to expand versus in the more developed countries where it's pretty stable. And so what are some of the factors that can actually influence the population and the distribution and the rates? So lower developed countries tend to have a larger population. However, even though more developed countries don't have as large of a population, they tend to be more wasteful and they tend to be a larger consumer of earth resources. So we can see here in this picture that the more developed country is actually a relatively smaller percentage compared to the less developed country. But as far as how much waste is being produced, the more developed country is consuming more, and they're also producing so much more hazardous waste compared to the lower developed countries. Right. So other factors that can contribute to the population distribution is how much resources are available in that area. So a population density is going to be the number of individuals in a unit area, and it's going to depend a lot on how much available resources there are. Population growth often is also dependent on some other factors. So the abiotic factor, for example, would be the weather, whether or not the weather is favorable for a population or not. And so think about this outside of humans. So for example, we have like these shrubs, and you can see that, you know, the number of shrubs that can reside in a unit area can kind of change. So for example, when these shrubs are young and small, they tend to grow in a lot more dense clusters, right? And so they tend to grow a lot more dense cluster. And as they become larger and more and larger here, they tend to have to compete with each other a little bit more for like resources. So for like nutrients in the dirt, they have to think about with regards to predator, if there's any predators that are eating the shrub. And so as they get larger, their distribution is a little more uniform and not so clustered anymore, because all of those different shrubs are all kind of competing with each other for their development in this little unit area, right? For many organisms, they also have to consider not only competitions with each other, like for food and mates and other resources, but maybe they have to compete with other organisms as well. And then also take into consideration like the predator and prey population. So oftentimes in different populations, we'll see a distribution where the predator and prey will exhibit this cycle where the species, whether it be prey or the predator, will fluctuate in response to the size of the other species. So you can kind of imagine, like let's say if you have a population of rabbits compared to a predator that might consume the rabbits, that when there's a lot of rabbits, the predators are able to thrive, but as the predators eating up all the different little rabbits, there's going to be less food source, and so you're going to have a drop in the predator survival. So then their populations can decrease, and now the rabbits can, without as much predators, they can start mating again. They can start reproducing offsprings. But as they reproduce offspring, then the predators are able to have more food resources, and so you end up with this cycle. So competition also has to do, returning back to these shrubs. So we talk about competitions, right? So as you go from the younger shrub to the larger shrub, these members of these shrubs are actually competing not only for space, but like, let's say light, right? And so if you can imagine if you have like some shrubs that are smaller, that's kind of growing in the shadow of other shrubs, and they're not getting as much light, they're not able to do as much photosynthesis, and so maybe they're not going to be as healthy. And then as they get smaller, and the shrub that's bigger, that's kind of thriving, that's in the sun, gets more light, is going to be able to take up that space, is able to make more food, is probably less likely to die if a predator comes by and consumes some of its leaves. The smaller ones might be already teetering on survival, so they might be more easily harmed. Next, we can kind of look at examples of effects that are on populations. So we kind of talk about competition, right? So we kind of talk about competition for like different resources, such as food. But sometimes the competition can also be for shelter, right? So here we have this picture where if there are a lot of available area for these little birds to be able to reside, then they're fine, everyone's happy, but the competition kind of happens when the population grows and the density increases. So then you end up having more birds than the amount of shelter, and so then they kind of have to start competing. So we see this in woodpeckers, where woodpeckers will have to compete for different nesting sites in order to be able to survive. So there's only so many tree holes that they can live in and provide for their offspring. So when there are more holes than pairs of birds, then every pair gets a home and a hole. But over time, if the population grows a lot and you don't have enough holes, then it gets harder for like the mating pair of woodpeckers to be able to provide home for their young, and so then that population is going to kind of decrease. And so this is an example of density dependent factor. Another example, as we kind of talked before, with regards to we used the example of rabbits, but here, for example, we can look at mice, right, where it's a density dependent factor might be the predator. So when there's a lot of mice, the predators are nice and healthy, they can consume the mice, but as the population drops, then the predators are not as healthy and thriving as well. So their population will also drop. And again, similar to the woodpecker, the mice population will also be dependent on if they can take shelter, right? If they can hide in these holes. So if there's enough holes and they can hide in them, then the predation rate is low. But if there are more mice than holes, then you have the predation rate being higher because they're more exposed, so they're more susceptible to predators consuming them. Kind of already visit this, but this is the predator and prey population cycle that we were talking about with regards to either the mice and hawk or with the rabbit and the predator. I didn't name a specific predator for the rabbit here, but let's say we can say the lynx is an example of it with the snowshoe hare. And so you can see that this can also depend on the snowshoe's rate of available resources for itself as well, right? So in order to thrive, they also have to make sure they have enough food, and when they have enough food, they can reproduce well, the population goes up, and then the lynx population will also go up, and then when the food source is low, then you have to snowshoes not being able to get as much food, their population decreases, so then the lynx population decrease. And so what you should notice with this graph is you'll see this cycle where the population of the snowshoe hare, which is in this purple here, versus the lynx, which is in this blue. You'll see that they will both rise together, but they'll also both drop together, and then they'll start rising, and then they'll drop again, and then they start rising and they'll drop depending on the population and the resources that are available. Another way that we can kind of predict population growth is looking at life history pattern. And there are two basic life history patterns. The first one is the opportunistic pattern. So organisms that fall into this pattern tend to have shorter lifespan. They tend to be fast to mature. They tend to have many offspring. And typically they don't take care of their offspring, right? So example of this would be like different insects, for example, where insects aren't known to take care of their offspring. They just kind of reproduce, and they just produce a lot of offspring and they mature really fast. They have a very short lifespan. And so another example would be weeds, right? Weeds are definitely opportunistic organisms because, again, they just grow really fast to kind of outcompete wherever they pop up. And they just kind of want to pop up. They spread their seeds super fast, and their lifespan is kind of short, but they're fast to mature. They're basically taking advantage of any opportunity that they can. Versus equilibrium life history pattern, organisms that fall into this pattern tend to have a longer lifespan. They tend to be larger individuals. They tend to be slower to mature. They produce less offspring. Many of them will spend a lot of their energy taking care of their offspring. Their growth rate tends to be regulated a lot by different density dependent effect. And so example of this would be like different mammals, right? So like this bear right here spends a lot of energy making sure that that little cub is going to be able to actually grow and become an adult and be healthy. And so these are two different life history patterns that can kind of predict for us what our expectations are with regards to their growth rate. And so what I want to actually spend a little bit of time focusing on is just the idea that different populations have different growth rates and different distribution and abilities to survive. And with equilibrium species, because they do tend to have longer lifespan and they don't reproduce as much, is that many of these equilibrium species are starting to go extinct, which is really sad, right? So their danger of extinction can be determined by the size of their geographical range. So like, are they limited to living in only certain habitat? So if they have very narrow, strict habitat, you can imagine that, and they can only survive in certain areas, that they're going to be more restricted and have a harder time spreading and surviving, right? Additionally, it has to do with their local population size. So in certain areas where, due to the geographic range, they tend to have smaller local population, they're more likely to go extinct compared to ones that have a larger local population. So you can see here that we have a range of factors with regards to different organisms and what are their geographical range and their degree of habitat tolerance and their size of their local population with regards to concern of whether or not we are worried if they're going to go extinct or not. As we go down this chart, we can see that as we're moving down to like the mountain gorilla, for example, they have a lot more restriction, so they're more likely to go extinct. All right, so I'm going to stop here with this kind of a sad note to leave on. But in general, I'm hoping that with population study that you got a more overall sense of different factors that should be taken to need for not only human population, but just the populations of many different organisms in general. Okay, I'll see you guys at the next one.